Jim Leffler here, continuing session 5. Today we're going to describe and talk about what was classically thought of as a defense mechanism, projective identification, and think about how perhaps we can think of it as a communication system. And this will actually set up a conversation in the weeks to come around how we can move from kind of identifying and categorizing psychic events into utilizing them in a transformation process. And projective identification is a move from kind of a categorization system of, is this transference, countertransference, defense, what's the experience, what's your experience, into the work of working through the emotional experience of an individual. So the first 2 sessions, we discussed setting up how to listen with frame, free association, evenly suspended attention. Sessions 3 and 4, we defined transference and countertransference. Transference being patient towards therapist, countertransference, therapist towards patient. And therapist, I mean, it can be an analyst, it can be a physician, it can be a mental health worker, it can be at any stage of the encounter with a person, from ongoing psychoanalysis to a singular event in an emergency department, to every 3-month weekly visits, every 3-month sessions for medications. And today, as I said in the preamble, we're going to move from content to process. So move from recognizing the elements. Is this transference, countertransference, to a process? And a process you can actually think about. Some people now in the 90s, early 2000s would write, instead of the word transference or countertransference, would actually write transference, countertransference as one hyphenated word, recognizing kind of the dual interactive nature and the reality that it can be hard to disentangle whose information is whose in a psychic process. We're going to look at this hypothetical. So imagine a patient comes for their 5th visit. This is a chronically depressed man in his mid-30s. He's flat, tone, taciturn. He's describing small details about the commute, a dinner he forgot to eat, an email he was unable to answer. And you have this inner awareness of a heaviness. The air is feeling like it's getting sucked out of the room. You glance up at the clock, and 12 minutes have passed, and you can't recall the last 3 sentences. And the patient says to you, you're probably tired of hearing about all of this. As I've done before, I'll just go through like 4 possible options. Again, any are possible. Again, 2 tend to shut down exploration. And if it's way too hot in the room, and meaning that the emotional temperature is very high, sometimes that can be the right move, and you need to kind of shut down exploration, and you need to offer support, and you need to make the room cooler. So you can reassure, I'm not tired, or I enjoy hearing about your day. That's what we're here for. You can apologize. I am sorry. I actually didn't catch those last few sentences. Do you mind saying them again? You can, those 2 shut down what could have been an opportunity to look at someone's mind. You can name the room, and instead of putting it one place or the other, just notice and comment on something feels heavy, and that kind of opens it up. It's kind of a pretty open comment to see where the patient goes with that. You could say nothing. Notice that the patient's just named a deadness that maybe he's put in you. And what do I mean by put in you? And that's what we're going to talk about in terms of projective identification. So, and the question that we're going to try to kind of look at is it possible that the heaviness you're experiencing isn't actually yours? So Klein was Melanie Klein, child analyst, was in Britain, and was, as Freud is growing older. Other people are moving in to take on the lineage and continue the project. One of those people in England is Melanie Klein, and she has a group. There's 3 groups: Melanie Klein's group, Anna Freud's group, and the middle group. And one of the more famous people in the middle group would be a person named Winnicott, another person, Ballant. But regardless, so Klein's in her group, and Klein thinks that and defines kind of projective identification as a defense. And so we've got to remember Klein's looking at a very early stage. She's interested in like the first year, 18 months of life, and thinks that a great deal of psychic events are happening in that time frame. And I'm not going to get into that metapsychology. I'm going to set that aside and just focus on the idea of projective identification. So it's primarily defensive, and what's happening is the baby is unable to tolerate this experience that they're having, and puts that out into the world and places it on the mother. And the world in projective identification usually is, you first have to split the world, so the world becomes, there's good and bad, and you retain one side of the split and push the other split into the world. And Klein really focused on how the child would hold on to the good and project the bad, but the opposite is also true. And you can, so she's focusing though on the intrapsychic events of the child to explain why they would develop, how to understand the experiences of envy and gratitude and mourning. But regardless, and there's a nod towards an intrapsychic element, but it's not fully articulated in Klein, because she says in her writing that it's put into the mother. So Wilfred Bion actually is analyzed by Klein and is a Kleinian. He later becomes something different in what's called like late Bion, and we're going to get into that next week with a concept called container-contained, but this actually sets us up for that. So for him, projective identification starts to be thought of not only as an intrapsychic, so what's going on in one person's mind, but an actual interpersonal form of communication, a primitive one. But it's not just a defense, it's actually a way of communicating material on a different plane that's not, it's a nonverbal communication of emotional, unconscious experience. And then Ogden, following this line, Ogden is an American psychoanalyst with some training in Kleinian thought, but also kind of an iconoclast. He has his own kind of way of seeing things. I think that's fair to say. And is you can actually go and meet Dr. Ogden. He still is in San Francisco, but he gives a mechanistic description of projective identification and adds kind of a new element in this mechanistic description that's definitely influenced by late Bion container-contained ideas, and breaks projective identification into 4 parts. So first part, and this is Kleinian, the patient, child, person projects part of the self, and it can be either a malignant part, and you're afraid of that malignant part internally because it might destroy you, or a benevolent part, and you banish that part into another person, maybe for protection, because you think of yourself as being all bad. So you project parts of the self into an other. So anytime, into an object. Within object relations theory, which is what we've waded into without me really saying it, there's an idea of a subject and an object. And an object can be a thing, it can be a person. Here we're primarily talking about a person, but if you really want to, people are trying to understand what is the projective identification and processing use of a AI. So it could also be an AI, can be an object. So you project part of the self into an object. The projector then controls the object by pressure from interactions. So I'm going to cause you to yell at me by doing subtly irritating, annoying things, not stopping those whenever I may be politely asked to. And then when you yell at me, then the idea that you're an angry person has come into reality. And that was the projected sense that I put into the other person. Now, the other person's going to receive the projection, and they can process it. Now, by processing the feeling, that does not necessarily mean it comes out going well. So the other person can receive it, and then just as you can process food by vomiting it out or going through the alimentary system and coming out digested, and you get the good nutrients out and you give back into the body the good things are given. So too, a projection can be absorbed by someone, and that can then be downregulated and given back to someone in small bites that they can eat, kind of like the mother bird who regurgitates food that's already half digested so her babies can take it in, versus it can also come in, dysregulate the person that received it, and they can actually amplify it. So they become an amplifier. Yeah, and it comes back even higher with more energy. And so now the projector can receive those two things back, and they can return it now through a counter projection that then induces certain actions in the other person and can process that feeling that had been put. Now you put a new feeling back. And so you can see how there's actually kind of a conversation at play here. And that conversation requires can require, particularly people that have difficulty holding on to their projections, can require some skill. So just an example of the downregulation would be like a child crying, and they walk into a room and a parent can say, "Oh gosh, I see you're crying, what's going on?" And then the kid's really unable to kind of describe it, but gives a couple of words like friend and hurt and didn't include, and then the parent can kind of put it together in their mind, organize it, and offer an interpretation really, and say, "Gosh, sounds like you really are feeling left out of what just happened." And then the kid is sad, but they can understand, yes, this is the feeling of left out, but I can survive that. My parents have heard about it. It's organizing. I can move on. Another way would be a kid walks into the room. The parent, I'm not blaming the parent. They're doing the best they can, but they are distracted, upset, distraught for their own reasons. A kid comes in crying, and they turn to the child and say, "I'm going to give you something to cry about." So now they've actually, in addition to whatever the child was experiencing, have kind of added this anger and fear, while at the same time teaching a lesson to suppress emotion maybe. But you can see how the parent actually got, when the feeling was put into them, they couldn't tolerate it, so it activates their own response, which then elevates this experience for the child, remains, and becomes even more confusing. As I'm saying that, I think you might be able to see how we can remove the word parent, therapist, and think about our role as not only offering verbal observations, interpretations, but also unconscious, on an unconscious emotional field level, absorbing the person's suffering or joy, because some people can't experience the joy, and offering it back to them in a way that can make sense and that they can accept it at that time. Thanks.